Good afternoon, everyone, and we're back after a short intermission. We're going to have a wonderful conversation between Major General Bo Young and former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, and we're really excited about this opportunity. And I can see the Secretary there and Bo. So Bo, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I hope you have a wonderful chat. I know you will.
Great. Thanks, David. And Secretary Nielsen, thanks so much for joining us today. On a day where the theme is national security, we really couldn't be better served by having such a renowned expert and global thought leader such as yourself here. And I know how busy your schedule is, and we appreciate you carving out time to talk to our eager audience. I'll do just a little bit of intro here to set the stage. For those who may not be familiar with you or your career, Secretary Nielsen graduated with a BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown. She went to the University of Virginia Law School, where she, of course, graduated. She was a corporate attorney early in her career and then a legislative assistant for Senator Connie Mack. And then after 9/11, she was instrumental in standing up the TSA as she started her government service. She served as a special advisor to President George W. Bush for 4 years, and then entered the private sector, where she led 2 different consulting firms dealing with national security. She's a certified expert civilian expert for NATO. She's led multiple advisory boards for the World Economic Forum. She sits on the President's National Infrastructure Council, Australia's Cybersecurity Board, and the Bipartisan Homeland Security Expert Group. Her last job in government was to serve as both the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House and, of course, the 6th Secretary of Homeland Security. She's currently the CEO and founder of Lighthouse Strategies, which works with investors and technology firms from startups to Fortune 100s on new and emerging threats to the homeland. So, Kirstjen, thanks again for being here. And I guess we just start off with sort of a big picture question, if you will, in terms of when you look at the state of our homeland security and the threats that are out there. Which would you say are the most challenging from your perspective, to us as a nation?
Sure, always the magic question, right? There's never a perfect answer to that. First, I just want to start by thanking you, Bo, and thanking America's Future Series. As you know, I can rarely say enough about the importance of constant innovation to address all of the threats that we face as a nation. And events like this are just so vital to, sort of infusing the environment with
Kirstjen, we're starting to lose your.
And there really is always.
There you go. It came back. We're losing your losing your audio there for a second. Sorry.
Hopefully it will. Hope it does. But anyway, on to your question. Yeah, DHS is it's the 3rd largest department in the U.S. It has over 240,000 law enforcement, civilian, and military employees. It's about a $70 billion annual budget. So it has a huge mission space. So when we talk about threats to the homeland, it really can be anything from cyber to critical infrastructure security to aviation to counterterrorism. Obviously, DHS has a branch of the military, the Coast Guard, preparing for natural disasters, combating transnational criminal organizations. It goes on. So for me, in answer to your question, when people always ask me a different version of that, which is what keeps me up at night, it really, in a nutshell, is that the arms of government today just move too slow to address this sort of evolving nature that we have with threats. So between automation, innovation, technological advance, computing power, we have tremendous efficiencies. We're always all delighted, or many of us are delighted when we realize, yes, there's an app for that too. But the downside of that is the hyperconnectivity and the interconnected environment in which we all work and live also presents new and novel vulnerabilities. So at a high level, it's trying to grasp what are the partnerships that we need, what's the technology that we need, how can we really help force multiply, if you will, against the threats. Some of the ones that we looked at were everything from new explosive device threats to aviation. Cyber obviously continues to be a daily threat that we all need to address at different levels. We looked at drones, which was emerging. We were able to get some legislation passed to give DHS authority to mitigate those and address those. WMD, trafficking, smuggling, and then, there's new and emerging crimes that go along with technological advance, such as live distance abuse, which I spent quite a bit of time with our Five Eyes partners trying to get a handle on. So myriad of threats, land, sea, air, cyberspace as well. And, the good men and women of DHS continue to work with their state and local and private sector partners to try to grapple all of those.
Our next panel up is going to talk about sort of the global environment, if you will, both from a standpoint of global investment as well as global markets. You mentioned the Five Eyes partners. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the state of cooperation amongst the Five Eyes partners, and maybe some good news out there that would make people feel better about this, the state of alliances and the state of partnerships.
Yeah, it can't really be overstated, the importance. We have this very outdated look at Homeland Security in the United States, which is that it somehow is limited to threats physically within what we consider to be the homeland, i.e. the continental United States. But the reality is that the threats over there, if you will, and the threats over here have merged. We can have nefarious actors and nation states attack us with the click of a mouse. So geographical boundaries no longer mean anything. And so because of that and the hyperconnectivity I mentioned before, partnerships with foreign governments become more and more important, and international organizations as well. Certainly NATO, Europol, Interpol, a lot of the cyber centers throughout the world become very, very crucial partners. DHS has signed and continues to sign a huge number of agreements with international countries. In fact, something that the audience might not know is DHS has personnel stationed in more than 75 countries throughout the world. So we have a huge international presence from our Department of Homeland Security throughout the world. And they focus on identifying together with their partners known and suspected terrorists, obviously cyber threats, organized crime rings. They still have a huge job on the proliferation of dangerous weapons. It's something that also many people don't think necessarily about DHS. And of course, interdicting drugs and human smugglers in all of our, air, land, and sea borders. So I think, the one thing that I have been excited about that DHS has focused on over the last working on agreement for countries on technology. And I think we're of why that's so important during the pandemic, but really working together to do research and development to understand together what the threats are and what the technology can do to mitigate. Another great example, the last 4 years, all the work that the department has done with its allies with respect to aviation security. That was a scientific endeavor to understand what is the technology that can really address the new explosive threats coming online. So I think there's a lot of good news there. There's certainly more to be done. Information sharing is a term that many people roll their eyes on. It's very overused, but at the end of the day, when you come to threats, it's really about that first warning and understanding how the threat is proliferating across boundaries is the difference between an attack and being able to stop it.
I wonder if you could also talk about the alliance, if you will, between the private sector and the government, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure in the U.S. And I think it's a huge vulnerability. It's areas that we've already seen get impacted, and yet there seems to be some reluctance in the private sector in some cases, and counting on or cooperating with the government to be able to protect that infrastructure. What can you say about that?
I think what we're seeing more and more, we've certainly also seen this through the pandemic, but we've seen this through major natural disasters over the last decade, is that the private sector continues to play a crucial role. Another often cited stat is that, over 80% of the critical infrastructure in the United States is owned and operated by the private sector. I've never been able to verify that specific stat, but I think the point is made, which is that when, as a citizen, you assume that your essential functions will continue to operate during a major event, whether that's electricity, whether that's water, whether that's communications. And the private sector plays more and more of a role in ensuring that continuity. So there's a real question of then what is the role of the federal government to support them in doing that? And of course, over the years, sometimes some sectors we regulate within the federal government, some are partnership based, some are voluntary in terms of moving forward standards. But communicating and understanding the interdependencies, I think, is key. And one of the things that DHS did over the last 5 years, we created the National Risk Management Center when I was there. And the goal of that was to work on a lot of what the previous administration had done, and the one before that as well, which is really understanding where is that connectivity. So if you're the owner operator of an electric company, what is it that you need to ensure your continuity? And the reality is that it's not always in your control. We're really at a place where your risk is now my risk and my risk is yours. So how do we together sort of address that? So in looking forward with partnerships, especially around cyber, it's really reviewing what does the private sector need from the government to be able to function. Sometimes that's grants, sometimes that's liability protection, sometimes that's information. Again, just based on interdependency, if you are assuming that you will be able to do something based on another sector, you need to have awareness of what that sector needs and what that sector is doing. So we see more and more private sector folks being read into programs in the federal government throughout, which I think is very helpful, very important. They provide context to the information that the federal government has. So when we look at threats, we see a very close partnership there. And again, I'll use an example of cyber. When we, as the federal government, understand cyber threats coming in, it's only once we contextualize them within a critical infrastructure sector that we understand what the possible consequences are. So having that feed, if you will, into the private sector really enables in return the federal government to be able to support and plan to mitigate. So it's a great question. There's never a silver bullet answer. ISACs, I think, are still a very important part of the fabric. And then, of course, working across geographical boundaries, it's not just critical infrastructure in the United States, as we see with supply chains, that is so important. It's critical infrastructure throughout the world. So making sure that we have the ability to stay in constant communication is key.
One of the earlier panels talked a little bit about supply chain and the rebasing or bringing back home some of the critical, whether they be pharmaceuticals or whether they be other elements of technology that the global economy has found the low cost producer, and it didn't happen to be in Omaha, Kansas. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your time there at DHS and any activities that you saw that in terms of the supply chain that made you feel more positive or were consistent with that reshoring those critical technologies.
Yeah, I think it's, to me, it's a important evolution of where we started after 9/11. When you think about critical infrastructure writ large, we really started out, understandably, in the United States with almost a feudal approach. We thought about buildings almost. And then we thought about what combination of guns, guards, and gates can we use to secure that building. We kind of quickly expanded from that to think more about systems. And then we started thinking about functions. And now we're really, I think, at a crossroads from understanding what are the critical nodes that, if they are attacked or disrupted, will cause a negative cascading effect throughout the country, throughout supply chains. And so from that view, you're really thinking about what is it that is required to ensure that functionality. And in this case, it's a particular item that could be produced abroad and then is transported to the United States. And when you really boil down to what are those critical essential workers, what are the critical essential functions, critical essential products from that interdependencies perspective, you start looking at it quite differently. Obviously, in the pandemic, we've seen quite a few examples of that, whether it was the gloves, whether it was the PPE, early days, the vaccine. So once you look at it from that criticality perspective, you start to realize if there's no redundancy built in, it is a true national security, homeland security risk. And so therefore, how can we secure that production and supply? And I think the way that the discussion seems to be moving is that there are, in fact, key items, key products, key processes that if we do not have enough control to ensure their reliability, we do, in fact, need to produce them at home. The problem with that is that, to your point, exactly right, which is about the low cost, it has been difficult for the private sector to produce that because there hasn't been a market at the price point at which they could produce it in the United States. So it really requires that partnership with Congress to think through, what are the incentives? What's the carrot? What can we provide the private sector to encourage them to do more? Another example of that would be in cyber. If I want to, for example, train for a marathon and I want to track my steps each day, I could use one of the free apps that comes with my phone, or I could pay $100 for an app that assures me that nobody will access my information and nobody will be able to attack my phone. The reality is that most people will choose the free one. So we've got a bit of an incentive issue there, both with the private sector producing and consumers buying, to help everyone understand that the security has to be built in, and how can we change the cost structure at which we think about it.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I know you're an investor as well as a board advisor for several startup and technology companies. I wonder when you look at those areas such as election security or border security, I wonder if you could comment on either your experience as an investor or as a secretary on specific interesting technologies that you saw out there. And, that obviously the cyber and the critical infrastructure would roll in there, but anything specific like that you'd like to share? A good portion of our audience are young entrepreneurs that might find your thoughts there really interesting.
Sure. I mean, first, just at a high level, I'd say space. Space is not really the next frontier. It's the frontier that's here today. And so anything that we can do to help secure any of our capabilities or assets in space, communications, for example, become very crucial. I spent quite a bit of time in various roles over the last decade, very concerned about GPS. If GPS were to go down, it's not just your Google Maps that won't work. We wouldn't be able to do microsurgery. We won't be able to do payment and settlement systems. We won't be able to have supply chains and transportation. So there are key assets that we really need to technologically look at of how we can secure and better provide their redundancy. What's on my mind is, there's a great quote that a lie can get across something, I'm paraphrasing, but something like the lie can get across the world faster than the truth has time to put its pants on. And I think we have seen that in a variety of ways, whether it's GPS spoofing, whether it's deep fake technology, or whether it's propaganda. And so technology that helps us understand what is reality is becoming more and more important, because reality itself is up for debate. What you see, you can't believe necessarily. What you hear, you can't believe necessarily. And that really bleeds over into identification. Passwords don't work. We know that. We tried different ways. We tried different multi-factor identification. But at the end of the day, we need a much better system for digital identification so that we can all be assured of who we're interacting with. And not just that, but who's interacting with our data, with our personal characteristics. How can we protect those and ensure that we have more control over how they're used? Interoperability is becoming more and more important in the sense that we have lots of legacy infrastructure in the United States technology, but we have lots of new and novel infrastructure coming online. So how do we make them work together? There's not every company, not every system that has the ability to start from scratch and build. So we need a way to incorporate older technologies. And for that matter, we need to find ways to go back offline. We think about a lot of our critical infrastructure. Automation is great, but once it's attacked, we've got to have that redundancy to be able to unplug and still produce the function. Other than that, I'm trying to think. Genomes are fascinating to me. There's some companies out there that are mapping the COVID genome, for example. That's tremendously helpful from a public policy perspective, because you start to understand not just who has COVID, but who's contagious, what mutation do they have. We can track the mutations across countries, across communities, and really understand what public policy interventions are working and what's not working, and what do we need to do next. Core security, we got to stop with the Band-Aids in terms of cyber. We have a new threat coming each day. We can't possibly expect companies to purchase yet something else to address that threat. So we need to think about, security at the hypervisor level, to have that core security, that area you can get back to good, if you will. We need to think about data diodes and how do we protect data and the stream, the entrance and exit of that data, the redundancy, the resiliency. We see that in election security. Election security is all about auditability. We need to ensure not just that you voted and your vote counted, but that it was counted correctly. And how do we know that? How do we have a trail such that the systems can be audited and ensure their security? So, Bo, there's so many, I know we're short on time. There's so many different ways I could take that, but I think the good news is there's no shortage of things to work on. It's really understanding the requirements in the mission space in which you are creating an innovation. I think what I see more than more common are innovators tend to sometimes innovate in a vacuum. And then when they go to deploy whatever it is they've invented into a mission environment, it may or may not work. So again, events like this are hugely important to compare the two pieces of the puzzle and really ensure that we can all leverage technological advances as much as possible.
Great. Well, we do have a couple of questions from the audience, but I think we'll have to leave it there. I think Secretary Nielsen, thank you again so much for your thoughts and your time. It was terrific to see you. And I know on behalf of all my colleagues at America Future Series, thank you very much for participating with us.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, thank you for having this event. Appreciate it.
All right. So for everybody else, we're going to take about a 2-minute break and then we'll start into the next panel. Thanks.